A deadly disease present across the world, leaving thousands dead while scientists battle to find a vaccine. Asymptomatic sufferers able to pass it on to unsuspecting victims with neither being the wiser. No, we're not talking about that disease. We are of course referring to typhoid, and today more specifically, the woman who became infamous for helping it spread through New York in the early 20th century, Mary Mallon, better known as Typhoid Mary. Born in Cookstown, County Tyrone in 1869, it's thought that the curse of typhoid was bestowed upon Mary Mallon from birth, as her mother suffered from it when she was born. At age 15, she left the Mallon seeking a better life in the United States, where she would stay with her aunt and uncle. For a time she worked as a maid, but by 1900 she found herself working as a cook for several wealthy families in New York, and it was during this period that she would gain her notoriety. Just 2 weeks after she began working at a residence in Mallon, several people came down with typhoid fever. Moving to Manhattan in 1901, she began working for a new family. Again, several developed typhoid symptoms, with it proving fatal for the family's laundress. Mallon was soon on the move once more and began working for a lawyer, but quickly left after 7 of the 8 family members fell ill. By now, if anyone suspected Mary of being the source, they didn't act on it, and she was able to continue moving from home to home. Fast forward to 1904, and Mallon found herself working for another lawyer, Henry Gilsey. Once again, the family's laundress fell ill, this time along with 4 other servants. The servants lived separately from the main household, so this time the family was spared. An investigator, Dr. R.L. Wilson, pinned the outbreak on the laundress, but was unable to prove it. By 1906, Mary had seemingly only infected one more person, another laundress, and no one was the wiser to the fact that she was the source. That would soon change. In August of that year, she took a job working for wealthy banker Charles Henry Warren and his family. She would travel with them to Oyster Bay, Long Island, to a holiday home marketed to the well-to-do. Over a week-long period, 6 of the 11 family members came down with the disease. Typhoid is caused by a bacteria found in unsanitary conditions, so for an outbreak to occur amongst a wealthy family on Long Island was virtually unheard of. Fearing that having his residence connected to an outbreak of this pauper's disease would put off future renters, the landlord employed several investigators to try and get to the bottom of the flare-up. All areas of the house where the bacteria could reside were checked and ruled out as being the source. An old lady who lived on the beach and who had sold the family clams became the new focus of the investigation. But when it was discovered that other families who had also eaten clams supplied by her hadn't fallen ill, she was soon ruled out as well. Unsatisfied with the inconclusive results, sanitation engineer George Soper was brought in. Soper had been investigating the outbreak in New York City, where some 3,000 people had been infected. He quickly set about trying to trace the root of this infection, working his way back through visitors to the house and the timeline of the infections. His attention was soon drawn to the fact that cases began not long after they took on their new cook, and that she left the household soon after the first case had been diagnosed. Looking deeper into her past, he soon found the trail of cases she left in her wake, along with the fact that she would disappear from the scene each time, leaving no forwarding address for her former employer. Soper also theorized that Mary was an asymptomatic carrier, the first known, able to spread the deadly bacteria without suffering any ill effects herself. Soper quickly became obsessed with tracing Mary, his day-to-day work becoming less like that of a sanitation engineer and more akin to that of a gumshoe detective. He was so determined to track down the spreader as he had seen the impact that typhoid outbreaks could have. Typhoid is a bacterial infection caused by a specific type of salmonella. Symptoms normally begin 6 to 30 days after exposure and can range from mild to severe. The most common symptom is a high fever along with severe stomach pains. This can quickly progress to chronic fatigue and delirium, with the bacteria causing intestinal hemorrhaging and even perforation. Eventually, the illness can lead to inflammation of various organs, including encephalitis, inflammation of the brain. If none of these lead to death, then usually dehydration or the added complication of pneumonia or bronchitis could see off the unfortunate sufferer. There was also little in the way of treatment for the condition at the time. Despite a vaccine existing, it was mostly given to soldiers to prevent them falling ill in the squalid conditions of the battlefield. In March of 1907, Soper was informed of another outbreak in a wealthy household on Park Avenue. The Bowen family were the unlucky ones this time around, with a maid and their daughter becoming ill. The daughter would eventually succumb to the disease. Soper already had his interest piqued by the news, but when he was informed that the cook was still working there, he set off immediately. Rushing to the scene, he finally came face to face with Mary, who was somewhat less excited about seeing Soper and hearing his accusations, threatening him with a carving fork when he asked her to supply urine and stool samples indeed. Soper would arrange another meeting with Mary, this time bringing along a medical doctor in an attempt to convince her. She again refused to give samples, stating that the outbreaks were everywhere, caused by contaminated food and water. With his options dwindling, Soper moved to have Mary arrested as a public health threat. She was a strong Irish woman, however, and it took 5 policemen to subdue her, with Soper's associate Dr. Josephine Baker having to sit on her at one point. She was then transported to Willard Parker Hospital, where she was forced to finally give samples. They showed massive amounts of the typhoid bacteria, and under questioning she revealed that she rarely washed her hands. This wasn't unheard of, however, as germ theory was still battling to replace the idea of miasma or bad air amongst many. Days after her first encounter with Soper, Mary was packed off to North Brother Island to be held in quarantine, still unbelieving that she was the carrier of the deadly bacteria. With his case complete, Soper published the story of his efforts in an article for the Journal of American Medical Association. This soon led to Mallon attracting massive media attention, and it would be they who would give her the nickname of Typhoid Mary. Mary was less than enamored with this new moniker, or Soper. He visited her and told her he would write a book and give her part of the royalties. Enraged, Mallon refused and locked herself in the bathroom until he had left. During the time on the island, Mary turned down an operation to remove her gallbladder, a procedure that was risky but that doctors thought would cure her condition. She was then subjected to a host of medical treatments and tests, leading her to feel as though she was being used as a guinea pig. Mary would remain quarantined on the island for nearly 3 years. It was then that the New York State Commissioner of Health decided disease carriers should no longer be isolated, stating that Mary could return to the mainland if she agreed to stop working as a cook and took the necessary steps to improve her hygiene so as to protect any future employers. Mary agreed, and in February 1910, she returned to the mainland. On her return, she found a job as a laundress, a seemingly popular profession at this time. This paid less than half the wage of a cook, however. An injury to her arm then became infected, would see her unable to work for 6 months. Finding herself in a financial bind, the temptation to return to the kitchen proved too much. Using false names and avoiding the agencies that found her work with wealthy families before, Mary moved into the mass sector, working in hotels, restaurants and spas. Again, she would move from job to job once a typhoid outbreak inevitably happened. Soper was once again put on the case but had trouble tracking her. That was until Mary began working at Sloan Hospital for Women, where 25 people became infected with 2 dying. The head obstetrician called in Soper to help find the cause, and he managed to identify Mary from the description given and a handwriting sample. She fled but was later captured by police and returned to North Brother Island 5 years after her release in March 1915, and it would be there that she would remain. By 1918, she was allowed to take day trips to the mainland, but always had to return to isolation. Eventually, she was given a private 1-story cottage on the island and a job as a lab technician, washing bottles, preparing glasses, and keeping records. At age 63, Mary had a stroke that left her paralysed down one side, and she passed away 6 years later in 1938. Her body cremated and buried back on the mainland in a ceremony attended by 9 people. By the time she passed away, more than 400 other asymptomatic carriers had been identified in New York, but she was the only one sentenced to live in quarantine, a victim of her condition and the infamy she received from media coverage. With the development of antibiotics and improvements in sanitation, typhoid has largely been eradicated in the West, though it still plagues many developing countries to this day. So, what do you make of the life of Mary Mallon? Do you think her forced isolation was justified to protect the masses, or did the authorities overstep the mark? For more on her life and Soper's investigation, the late great Anthony Bourdain wrote a book all about it, and you can find a link to that in the description below. While you're there, why not hit that subscribe button if you haven't already? Right then, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.